Family Guy's anger looks like nothing more than cartoon chaos. A chicken fight, a family brawl, one more punchline for the highlight reel. Harmless, exaggerated, built to make you laugh and move on to the next episode. Then, someone studying family therapy sat down and read the Griffins like an actual case file. What they found is where this video begins. In this video, we break down Family Guy's anger problem, the coupon that started a war. Family Guy begins most of its stories the same way. Something small happens. Peter Griffin reacts to it in a way that makes no sense at all. Then, the story runs with that reaction until it turns into something much bigger and much stranger than anyone expected. No piece of the show follows that pattern more clearly or for longer than the fight between Peter and a chicken named Ernie. Before getting into how that fight started, it helps to understand who Peter is in the years before it. In the earliest seasons of the show, Peter Griffin is a father living in the town of Quahog, Rhode Island, with his wife Lois and their 3 children, Meg, Chris, and Stewie. He works at a toy factory. He drinks beer with his neighbors. He loves his family in his own clumsy way, even when he forgets to show it. He is not written as a violent man in any planned sense. He is written as a man with almost no breaks. If something annoys him, he does not sit with it. He does not talk it out. He responds right away, and usually with far more force than the situation calls for. That habit shows up in small jokes throughout the early seasons. It becomes something much bigger once Ernie the giant chicken enters the picture. Ernie is exactly what his name says he is. He is a chicken, drawn at the size of a grown man who wears no clothing and speaks no words in most of his appearances. He does not explain himself. He does not need to. His entire relationship with Peter is built around one incident that happened before the audience ever saw a single frame of it. The first time Ernie is mentioned by name happens in an episode called Da Boom. This episode is the 3rd episode of season 2, and it first aired on December 26, 1999. The story itself has nothing to do with chickens. It is about the Griffin family living through a nuclear disaster caused by the Y2K computer bug, a real fear many people had at the end of 1999 about computers failing once the calendar rolled over into the year 2000. In the episode, before that disaster hits, Peter is at a store when a man dressed in a chicken suit offers him a coupon. Peter refuses it right away. He does this because he is remembering something that already happened to him once before, something the audience has never seen up to this point. He recalls that he once received an expired coupon from a giant chicken named Ernie, and that the moment led to a massive, destructive fistfight. That is the entire origin of one of the show's longest-running relationships. Not a rivalry built on years of conflict, not a grudge between 2 characters who wronged each other in some serious way. A coupon that had already expired. A small, forgettable mistake made by someone working a low-paying job, probably not even paying attention to what he was handing out. And Peter's reaction to that mistake was not annoyance. It was not a complaint to a manager. It was a fistfight so large that by his own memory of it, it counts as one of the defining physical confrontations of his life. What makes this moment worth slowing down on is how the show chooses to introduce it. The audience does not get to see the fight happen. They only get to hear about it, secondhand, through Peter's own memory, treated as a throwaway line in an episode that is really about something else entirely. This is important because it tells you exactly how normal this kind of reaction is supposed to feel inside the world of the show. Nobody in the scene reacts with shock when Peter mentions the fight. Nobody asks him why he beat up a chicken over a coupon. It is treated the same way a person might mention getting into an old argument with a coworker. Just background information. Something everyone in Quahog already knows about Peter, the same way they know he works at a toy factory or that he loves beer. That detail matters more than it looks like it should. A person's most important character traits are often revealed by what other people do not react to. If everyone around Peter treats a violent overreaction to an expired coupon as unremarkable, that tells you the town of Quahog, and by extension, the show itself, has already decided that this is just who Peter is. Not a version of him having a bad day, not a one-time slip, a pattern so familiar to the people around him that it does not even earn a raised eyebrow. The audience does not actually get to see a full chicken fight play out on screen until later, in Season 4, in an episode called Blind Ambition. This episode marks the first time a fight between Peter and Ernie is shown from beginning to end, rather than only referenced after the fact. By this point, the show had been building its style for a few years, and the fight in Blind Ambition reflects that. It is not a quick punch or two followed by a cutaway joke. It is a long, drawn-out battle that moves across multiple locations, wrecking property and injuring bystanders along the way. It borrows the visual language of big action movies, the kind of movies where two rivals crash through walls, fall from high places, and somehow keep getting back up, no matter how much damage they take. The choice to build the fight this way says something important about how the show wanted the audience to feel about it. A short, one-off punch would read as a simple joke about a man losing his temper. A long, choreographed battle with action movie music and slow-motion hits plays very differently. It turns Peter's anger into a kind of spectacle. It asks the audience to enjoy watching him lose control completely, the same way people enjoy watching a fight scene in a blockbuster film. The show is not condemning Peter's reaction in this moment. It is celebrating it, framing it as entertainment on the same level as the movies it is clearly copying. Inside the fight itself, small details reveal a great deal about what the show believes an out-of-control temper actually looks like. The destruction is never limited to the two people fighting. Cars get flattened, buildings crack, people standing nearby get knocked over or hurt simply for being in the wrong place. Peter does not check his surroundings before throwing a punch. He does not think about what happens to a fence, a mailbox, or a parked car caught in the middle of his fight. His anger, once it takes over, does not leave room for anyone or anything else to matter. That detail repeats across almost every version of this fight that follows in later seasons. The chicken feud is never just a conflict between two characters. It is always a small disaster for everyone standing nearby who had nothing to do with the original argument. There is also something worth noticing in how the fight always ends. Peter wins. He always wins. Ernie ends up beaten, often looking dead or close to it, while Peter limps away bruised but alive, usually going right back to whatever he was doing before the fight started, as if nothing happened. This detail becomes a running structure across the whole feud, something the next section covers in more depth, but it starts here in this first full fight. Winning does not calm Peter down or teach him anything. It does not make him reflect on why he keeps ending up in these situations. He treats a fight that levels part of a street the same way most people treat a minor errand, something to get through, then move past without a second thought. This is one of the clearest patterns the show sets up around Peter's anger, and it begins with this feud specifically because the trigger is so small. If Peter fought Ernie over something serious, like a threat to his family or a real injustice, audiences might read his violence as understandable, even if it went too far. An expired coupon removes that excuse completely. There is no way to view this fight as justice. There is no version of events where Peter is standing up for something that matters. The show picked the smallest possible reason for a conflict this large on purpose. It wanted a clean example of what happens when frustration gets no outlet other than immediate, overwhelming force. Real anger, the kind actual people experience, rarely comes from the size of the event that triggers it. It usually comes from everything sitting underneath that event already. A person cut off in traffic is not really furious about the car in front of them. They are furious about their job, their morning, their tiredness, their whole week, and the car just happened to be the final small thing that broke through. Peter's fight with Ernie works the same way, except the show removes any deeper explanation entirely. There is no bad day mentioned, no stress at work, no fight with Lois earlier that morning, just a coupon, expired, handed over by someone doing his job badly, and from that, a fight big enough to wreck a city block. That absence of explanation tension is not a flaw in the writing, it is the entire point. By giving Peter no real reason to be this angry, the show forces the audience to sit with an uncomfortable truth about how anger actually works for some people. It does not always need a big trigger. Sometimes a person is simply carrying more tension than anyone around them realizes, and it takes almost nothing to set it off. Peter never explains why the coupon bothers him so much because he probably could not explain it himself. He just reacts. The show never asks him to look inward, and for years, neither does anyone else in his life. It also matters that the person on the other end of all this anger is a chicken and not a human being. This choice removes almost all of the real consequences that would come from this kind of violence if it happened between two people. Nobody in Quahog seems concerned that a man is repeatedly and violently assaulting another resident of the town. Ernie is not treated like a victim of ongoing abuse, even though, if you strip away the cartoon logic, that is close to what is happening. He is treated like a force of nature Peter occasionally has to deal with, similar to bad weather or a broken appliance. This framing lets the show keep the fight funny instead of disturbing. It also lets Peter avoid any real responsibility for what he does during these fights, since nobody around him treats it as something requiring responsibility in the first place. Looking at this pattern from a distance, the coupon fight becomes something closer to a blueprint than a single joke. It shows a version of anger that arrives instantly, expresses itself through total physical force, causes damage far beyond the person who caused the initial problem, and then disappears completely once the fight ends, with no processing, no guilt, and no change in behavior. Peter does not walk away from that first fight promising himself he will handle future frustrations differently. He walks away and goes back to his day. The show gives him no arc here, no lesson, no growth. That absence becomes one of the most repeated ideas across the entire show, appearing again and again in almost every version of Peter's anger for the next 2 decades of episodes. None of this means the fight was written as some sort of serious warning about temper problems. Family Guy built its identity on jokes like this one, stretching a small moment into something enormous purely for comic effect. And the chicken fight succeeded because it was funny, not because it was trying to make a point about anger management. But intention and effect are not always the same thing. A show can build a joke purely for laughs and still end up creating one of the clearest pictures of unprocessed anger ever put into a long-running cartoon. The coupon fight works as comedy first. It also works, almost by accident, as a small case study in what happens when a person has no other way of releasing frustration besides throwing themselves entirely into a fight. The lasting popularity of this feud also says something about the audience watching it. People kept responding to these fights, kept quoting them, kept waiting for the next one to show up in a new episode. Part of that comes from pure spectacle, the same reason people enjoy watching movie fight scenes, even when the story reason behind them is thin. But part of it likely comes from something closer to recognition. Almost everyone has felt a version of what Peter feels in that grocery store, a small annoyance landing at exactly the wrong moment and setting off a reaction that feels far too big for the situation. Most people do not turn that feeling into a city-wide brawl. Watching a cartoon character do exactly that, with no restraint and no consequences, gives the audience a strange kind of release. It is funny because it is impossible. It is also familiar because the feeling underneath it is not impossible at all. This first fight in Blind Ambition set a template the show would return to again and again for years, expanding it into something much bigger than a single joke about a bad coupon. Peter and Ernie would go on to fight across trains, ships, subways, construction sites, even briefly across time itself, each new fight raising the stakes while keeping the same basic shape from this first encounter. Every time, the trigger stays small. Every time, the destruction stays large. Every time, Peter walks away from it without learning a single thing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What that longer pattern looks like across the years that follow, how many times the two of them actually fought, and how a small, one-time reference in a Y2K disaster episode eventually grew into one of the show's most quoted running gags, is where the story goes next. Section 2. 6 fights, 1 truce, 0 lessons learned. The first full chicken fight in Blind Ambition did not end the feud between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken. It started it. Once the show discovered how well this kind of fight worked, it kept coming back to it, spreading it out across more than a decade of episodes. Each new round bigger, stranger, and more destructive than the last. Taken together, these fights form one of the clearest, longest-running proofs of the same idea introduced in the first section. Peter never processes his anger. He only discharges it over and over against the same target without ever learning a single thing from any of it. One of the earlier expansions of the feud happens in an episode called Meet the Quagmires, an episode built around Peter traveling into his own past. While there, his meddling in earlier events causes a strange, almost accidental version of the usual conflict. Instead of a coupon setting things off, young Peter ends up punching Ernie by mistake while dancing at a school event called Enchantment Under the Sea, a nod to the same kind of high school dance featured in the Back to the Future movies. This version of the fight is smaller and stranger than the others, but it matters because it shows that the feud is not limited to a single timeline or a single version of Peter. Even given the chance to relive his own life and change things, Peter still finds a way to end up throwing a punch at the same chicken. The show seems to be suggesting, almost as a side joke, that this particular kind of conflict was always going to happen, no matter what choices Peter made along the way. A larger and more elaborate fight takes place in an episode called Internal Affairs, and this one carries some real weight behind the scenes as well as on screen. According to comments made by series creator Seth MacFarlane during commentary for a later episode, he had originally planned for this fight to end with Ernie's death for good. It was one of the show's animators, Peter Shin, who convinced him to keep the character alive, arguing that Ernie still had more to offer, including a planned appearance in a future Family Guy movie. That single decision behind the scenes is part of why the feud was able to keep growing for so many more years. Without it, the chicken fights might have ended far earlier than they did. The fight in Internal Affairs itself begins because Ernie returns to attack Peter while Peter is defending his friend Quagmire, giving the feud a rare moment where Peter's part in the fight starts from something slightly more than pure coincidence. From there, the two of them battle across a train station, then a cruise ship, and finally an airport, tearing through each location with the same disregard for anyone or anything caught nearby that marked their very first fight. The airport section includes one of the most memorable single images in the entire feud, a moment where Ernie's head appears to be sliced by the spinning propeller of an airplane, directly copying a famous scene from the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. True to form, Ernie is not actually finished. His leg is shown twitching into a fist even after the apparent injury, a small but clear signal that he is going to come back again, the same way he always has. This fight also introduces a specific scream sound used by Ernie in later appearances, giving the character a small signature that carries forward into future episodes. Not every fight in the feud ends in pure destruction with nothing gained. One stands out because it comes closer than any other to actually resolving things between the two of them, at least for a little while. After spotting each other again, Peter and Ernie tear through the Griffin family home, then into the sewers underneath Quahog, then a subway system, a construction site, an airplane, and finally a Ferris wheel, hitting almost every kind of location the writers could think of to keep the fight visually different from the ones before it. By the end of all that destruction, the two of them appear to have genuinely forgotten what started the fight in the first place. Instead of walking away angry, Ernie does something none of the earlier fights ever showed him doing. He invites Peter out to dinner to make peace over the trouble caused by what began all the way back at the start of the feud as nothing more than an expired coupon. At that dinner, the show fills in details about Ernie that had never come up before. He brings his wife along, a chicken named Nicole, and it is during this meal that his own name is finally spoken out loud by another character, rather than only appearing in credits or wiki descriptions. For a moment, the entire relationship between Peter and Ernie looks like it might actually be over. Two grown adults, or in this case, a man and a giant chicken, sitting down to share a meal and put a years-long feud behind them. That peace does not last through dessert. The argument that restarts everything is not about anything the two of them fought over originally. It is about who should pay the bill. Both Peter and Ernie insist on covering the check, and that small disagreement is enough to send both of them right back into full violence. This detail matters just as much as anything shown during the fights themselves. The show had a clear opportunity here to give Peter something resembling growth. He could have let the feud end quietly over a shared meal. Instead, a brand new, equally small disagreement takes the place of the old one, proving that the size of the original coupon incident was never really the issue. The issue is that Peter, and to some extent Ernie as well, cannot let a disagreement go unanswered, no matter how minor it is. Remove one trigger, and another one will appear to take its place almost immediately. A later fight pushes the entire concept even further, moving out of the world of realistic action movie chaos and into something closer to science fiction. This one starts because Peter accidentally backs his car into Ernie's, a small traffic accident that could have been settled with an insurance exchange and an apology. Instead, the two of them begin fighting again, and during the struggle, they land on a time travel device belonging to Stewie, sending them tumbling through different points in history. Their fight continues inside a genetic research lab and even out into space before the two of them crash back down to Earth on top of an oil rig, still fighting the entire way through. The rig is eventually destroyed, and Ernie appears to be killed by the rocket engines involved in the crash. Just as in every previous fight, that ending does not hold. Ernie survives, continuing to live despite an injury that would have ended the conflict permanently in almost any other kind of story. This particular fight also came at an important point in the show's own real history. Family Guy was canceled by its network in the early 2000s, then brought back a few years later after strong sales of the show on DVD convinced the network to give it another chance. According to reviews written at the time, this time travel chicken fight aired as the third episode after that comeback, and it was seen by fans and critics as an early signal that the show had returned to full strength. In other words, one of the clearest, most over-the-top examples of Peter's unprocessed, repeating anger also became one of the moments used to prove the show itself was back and working the way it used to. The feud was not just a running joke by this point. It had become a kind of measuring stick for whether the show still had its old identity intact. Not every appearance of the feud plays out as a full battle. In one later episode, Ernie is used for something almost helpful in a strange, backwards kind of way. Peter is dealing with amnesia, and according to an old idea often used in movies and television, another blow to the head is sometimes shown as a way to reverse memory loss. Ernie provides exactly that, hitting Peter with a crowbar, a shovel, a baseball bat, and other objects in quick succession until the amnesia clears. It is a strange twist for a relationship built entirely on repeated violence to also become the accidental cure for a medical problem, but it fits the same pattern already established. Whatever the situation, whatever the excuse, physical force between these two characters is always presented as the answer. This episode also reveals something small but interesting about Ernie's life outside of these fights. He is shown to be an actual citizen of Quahog, complete with a house and a mortgage he has to pay, giving him a level of ordinary human responsibility that stands in sharp contrast to the chaos he causes every time he runs into Peter. Across all of these fights, spread out over more than a decade of the show's run, a clear shape starts to form. The size and scale of each individual fight grows over time, moving from a single street corner all the way up to outer space, but the internal logic behind every one of them stays exactly the same as it was at the very beginning. Something small happens. Peter and Ernie respond with total, overwhelming force. The surrounding world takes serious damage. One of them appears to die, or nearly die and yet somehow survives. Nothing about the relationship changes as a result. No lesson gets learned. No real peace holds. Not even the peace that comes from sharing an actual meal together. The two of them simply reset, waiting for the next small disagreement to set the entire cycle back into motion. That cycle did eventually come to an end, though not in the way most of the earlier fights suggested it might. For years, Ernie's near deaths became something the audience learned to expect and even look forward to, since every previous injury, no matter how severe it looked, had always turned out to be temporary. He had survived being seemingly killed by an airplane propeller. He had survived being roasted by rocket engines during a fall from space. In a later season, he even survived a serious illness that nearly ended his life, for a very different reason, unrelated to Peter at all. Given that history, there was no obvious reason to expect any future injury to be permanent. That changed in an episode called The Chicken or the Meg. In this episode, Ernie's death finally sticks, and the character who ends things for good is not Peter at all. It is Meg Griffin, who rips Ernie's head off during the events of the episode, leaving the rest of his body running around without it for a moment, before everything stops completely. There is no return this time, no twitching leg, no sudden reveal that he survived after all. Ernie joins a short list of characters on the show who are confirmed to have died and remained dead going forward, a list that also includes a handful of other long-time side characters from across the show's run. The decision to end the feud permanently did not happen quietly, and it did not happen without acknowledgement from the people actually making the show. In an interview given to the entertainment news outlet TV Line around the time the character's death aired, one of the show's longtime executive producers, Alex Sulkin, spoke directly about the choice to finally let Ernie go. He explained that the chicken had, in his words, gone the way of all flesh, a phrase used to describe something reaching a natural, unavoidable end. He pointed out that the show had already pulled so many strong, memorable action sequences out of the character over the years that topping those earlier fights had become genuinely difficult for the animation team to manage. He also noted something that many longtime viewers may not have realized on their own, which is that a full-length chicken fight, of the kind shown across the fights covered in this section, had not actually appeared on the show in close to 15 years before Ernie's final death. The character had, in a sense, already faded out of the show's regular routine long before the writers made his ending official. That timeline detail changes the way this entire feud should be understood. The chicken fights were never a constant, ongoing presence stretched evenly across the whole history of the show. They were concentrated heavily in an earlier stretch of years, built up quickly, expanded quickly, and then largely left alone as the show moved into new seasons and different kinds of stories. By the time Ernie died for good, the character was closer to a piece of the show's earlier identity being formally closed out than an active, ongoing storyline being cut short in its prime. Looking across the full run of these fights, from a quiet coupon complaint all the way to a spaceship crash, and finally to a permanent, unglamorous death at the hands of a completely different character, the entire feud works as one of the clearest single examples the show ever built of anger with absolutely no ending point built into it. Every attempt to close the story, whether through violence, through a shared meal, or through the simple passing of years without a new fight, eventually gets undone or forgotten, until an outside event unrelated to the original argument finally shuts the door for good. Peter never resolves anything with Ernie through understanding, through change, or through growth. The feud ends the same way most of Peter's other conflicts across the show tend to end, not through insight, but through simple exhaustion, timing, or circumstance finally running its course. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The chicken feud offers the clearest window into this pattern because it repeats in such an obvious way, stretched across years of episodes with the same shape each time. time, but it is far from the only place in the show where this kind of anger shows up. One later episode takes this exact idea and turns it into the direct subject of an entire story, giving it a title that leaves nothing open to interpretation. Section 3, the episode literally called Lethal Weapons. Every other section in this video deals with anger that shows up as a side effect of something else happening in the story. The chicken feud grew out of a coupon complaint that spiraled into years of running jokes. This next episode does not hide what it is about. It puts the subject directly in its title, borrowing the name of a well-known action movie franchise and turning it into a joke about the Griffin family itself. The episode is called Lethal Weapons. It is the 7th episode of Season 3, and it first aired on August 22nd, 2001, though it was actually produced a year earlier, in 2000. Of every episode covered so far, this is the one that comes closest to being a direct essay on anger, built entirely around a single question. What happens to a household once one person in it stops holding back? The setup for the episode has nothing to do with anger at first. Every fall, the town of Quahog fills up with tourists from New York City who travel north specifically to look at the changing colors of the leaves. Locals call these visitors leafers, and their yearly arrival puts a strain on the whole town, crowding streets and testing the patience of everyone who actually lives there. Lois's neighbor Bonnie invites her to try a martial arts class called Taijitsu as a way of working through the frustration the leafers cause. Lois takes to it fast. Within a short time, she has earned a black belt, something the show treats as both impressive and slightly alarming, since nothing about her life up to this point suggested she had this kind of physical ability sitting inside her. The turn from impressive to alarming happens quickly. Peter almost gets into a fight with one of the tourists early in the episode, and instead of letting him handle it or stepping in to talk him down, Lois beats up the tourist herself to keep Peter safe. Brian and Peter both read this as something Lois should feel embarrassed about, a woman losing her composure in public. Peter, never one to miss an opportunity, decides that if his wife has apparently turned into someone capable of frightening off angry tourists, he might as well put that ability to use. He brings her along to a bar and provokes a group of leafers into a fight, knowing Lois will step in and finish it for him. She does. The bar brawl ends with the tourists thrown out and Peter completely unharmed, having let his wife take on physical risk that should have been his to deal with in the first place. This detail matters because it shows a different kind of anger problem sitting inside the same episode as the one building in Lois. Peter is not the one losing control here. He is doing something quieter and, in its own way, just as troubling. He notices someone close to him becoming dangerously aggressive, and rather than trying to slow that down, he finds a way to benefit from it. He treats his wife's growing temper as a tool he can point at other people whenever it suits him, without any concern for what continuing to feed that temper might do to her or to their marriage over time. What it does to Lois becomes clear very quickly. Her aggression stops being something she can turn on and off depending on the situation. She attacks her own martial arts instructor, the person who was supposed to be guiding her through this new skill in a controlled way. At home, her behavior changes just as sharply. She begins pressuring Peter for sex in a way that leaves no real room for him to say no, and the show plays his reaction the next morning as awkward and shaken rather than as a straightforward comedy beat. Brian, seeing the state Peter is in, reacts with real concern rather than laughter, which is a small but telling choice. Family Guy is a show built almost entirely on jokes, often at the expense of good taste, but even inside an episode packed with exaggerated slapstick, this particular moment gets treated as something closer to disturbing than funny. It is one of the clearest signs in the whole episode that Lois's transformation has stopped being a source of comic relief and started becoming something the show itself seems slightly uneasy about. The turning point that finally forces the family to notice the problem comes from an unexpected direction. Stewie walks in on Peter eating a box of his graham crackers and reacts with anger completely out of proportion to the offense, which, given everything already happening in the house, barely stands out anymore. Later, after Peter tells Brian what Lois did, meaning her aggressive and controlling unsettling behavior from the night before, Stewie overhears enough to become furious all over again, and this time he acts on it directly, hitting Peter with a baseball bat. That single moment is what finally convinces Lois that something in the house has gone seriously wrong. She does not connect this to her own recent behavior at first. She frames it as a problem belonging to the family as a whole, announcing that from this point forward, there will be no more anger allowed under her roof. That announcement is worth sitting with for a moment, not because of what it says, but because of who is saying it. Lois is the person whose aggression started this entire chain of events, from the fight with the Leafers to the confrontation with her instructor to the pressure she put on Peter at home. She is now the one drawing a line and declaring the house free of anger going forward, as if the anger belongs to everyone except her. This is not framed by the show as hypocrisy in any pointed or dramatic way. It plays out quickly, almost as a throwaway line leading into the next scene, but it captures something true about how anger tends to work inside families in general. The person causing the most damage is often the last one to recognize their own part in it, and the easiest way to avoid that recognition is to turn the problem into something everyone else needs to fix. Lois decides that Stewie's outburst is the one that needs professional attention, and she takes him to the Quahog Child Psychology Center to see a psychologist named Dr. Morin. During the session, the psychologist asks a simple, reasonable question, wanting to know whether Stewart has any history of aggressive behavior. Lois answers with total confidence that he does not, insisting that hitting Peter with the bat was the very first violent thing Stewie has ever done. From across the room, Stewie corrects her, pointing out, in his usual, overly formal way of speaking, that technically his first act of violence happened before he was even born, joking that he had already been plotting against her from inside the womb. It is a dark joke, delivered with total calm, and it lands specifically because Lois has just told a mental health professional something that anyone who has spent real time around this family would know is completely untrue. Stewie's aggression did not start with a baseball bat. It has been there from the very beginning of his life on the show, something covered in more detail later in this video. In this moment, though, the point is smaller and sharper. Lois is bringing her son to get help for a problem she does not actually understand, based on a version of events that leaves out almost everything relevant. The session with Dr. Morin does not go well. Stewie attacks him during the appointment, which means the one attempt in this episode to bring in outside professional help ends in more violence rather than any kind of progress. This detail becomes important in the section that follows this one, since it is not treated as a strange, isolated event confined to this single episode. It fits into a larger pattern across the show, where any attempt to get real help for a Griffin family member's anger tends to collapse almost immediately, usually through more of the same behavior the visit was supposed to address in the first place. With the visit to the psychologist ending in failure, the tension in the house does not go away. It shifts back onto Peter and Lois directly, and this is where Brian makes a decision that ends up making everything worse instead of better. Trying to calm down an argument between the two of them, he offers them what he claims are mood-elevating drugs, medication meant to help settle their nerves and ease the tension building in the house. In reality, he is lying. What he actually gives them are placebo pills, nothing more than sugar with no real effect at all. This detail says something important about how the family tries to solve problems throughout the episode. Nobody looks for a real solution. Lois announces a ban on anger without addressing where the anger came from. Stewie gets taken to a psychologist under false information. Brian hands out fake medication instead of encouraging an honest conversation. Every attempt at fixing the problem in this episode is either incomplete, misinformed, or outright dishonest, which makes it almost inevitable that the underlying tension is going to explode eventually, since nothing happening around it is actually built to hold it back. That explosion arrives quickly once the placebo pills fail to do anything. Peter and Lois start arguing again, and this time it turns physical. Lois strikes Peter first, and does so with a clear sense of satisfaction, treating the moment as a kind of victory. Peter, having reached his limit, hits her back. Lois immediately protests, telling him he cannot hit her her because she is a girl, as though the standard that applied to her striking him does not apply in reverse. Peter's response is short and dry, telling her that sometimes he wonders about that. It is a small exchange, but it captures the exact kind of double standard that runs through a lot of real arguments about fairness in conflict, played here for a quick laugh rather than any deeper examination, though the underlying idea still comes through clearly enough on its own. From there, the fight spreads outward, the way anger inside a house often does, catching people who had nothing to do with the original argument. Chris starts cheering for his father, treating the fight like a sporting event rather than something alarming happening between his parents. Meg gets angry at Chris for cheering, blaming their father for starting things in the first place. Chris fires back, reminding her that it was actually their mother who lost control first, not their father. Meg, frustrated, shoves him, and Chris responds immediately, telling her he does not like being touched, before turning the disagreement physical as well. Stewie and Brian, watching all of this unfold, begin fighting each other too, seemingly for no real reason connected to anything that started the argument in the first place. Within a short span of time, every member of the household is involved in some form of physical conflict, and the anger that began with Lois's martial arts class has fully spread through the entire family, touching every single person living under that roof. The house itself takes the damage that usually falls on parked cars and storefronts during Peter's fights with Ernie the chicken. Furniture gets destroyed. A painting depicting the rear end of a horse ends up smashed directly over Peter's head during the chaos, which briefly turns the fight into something almost silly enough for the family to laugh at together. For one short moment, everyone stops fighting and starts laughing instead, seemingly realizing all at once just how ridiculous the entire situation has become. That moment of shared laughter looks, for a few seconds, like it might actually be the resolution the episode has been building toward. Then Stewie picks up a chair and hits Lois with it, restarting the violence immediately and erasing whatever ground that brief laugh had managed to create. By the end of the episode, the family is completely worn out, and they finally stop fighting. Not because anyone has resolved anything, but because everyone has simply run out of energy to keep going. Sitting in the wreckage of their own home, they land on an explanation for what just happened, and the explanation they choose is television. Not their own individual choices, not Lois's decision to push her aggression onto everyone around her, not Peter's decision to use his wife's temper for his own convenience instead of helping her manage it, not Stewie's long, well-established history of violent behavior that predates this entire episode. Television, according to the exhausted family sitting in their destroyed living room, is what caused all of this. That ending is where the title of the episode earns its full meaning. Lethal Weapons borrows its name from a famous set of action movies built around explosive, over-the-top violence delivered as entertainment. By naming an episode about a family tearing itself apart after that franchise, the show places its own household squarely inside the same category as the kind of media violence people were arguing about at the time, back when television and video games were commonly blamed in public conversation for causing real aggression in the people who watched or played them. The joke lands specifically because the Griffins get everything backward. They do not turn violent because of something they watched on a screen. They turn violent because of choices they made themselves, one after another, none of which had anything to do with television at all. Blaming the screen at the end is easier than admitting any of that, and the show seems fully aware of how convenient and how wrong that excuse really is. Peter takes that blame even further once the family lands on it, publicly criticizing the network for putting this kind of programming on the air in the first place. Lois warns him against saying anything negative about the network, but Peter brushes off the concern, confident there is nothing they could possibly do to punish him for speaking out. Right after he says this, the animation itself seems to punish him for it. As Peter walks toward the kitchen, his movement becomes stiff and rough for a moment, drawn with noticeably less detail than the rest of the episode. A visual joke suggesting the network cut the show's budget right there on screen as a direct response to what he just said. It is a small, self-aware touch, closing out an episode about a family blaming an outside outside force for their own behavior, with the show poking fun at its own real relationship with the network broadcasting it. Taken as a whole, Lethal Weapons stands apart from almost everything else covered so far because of how directly it takes on its subject. The chicken feud let anger live inside an exaggerated, cartoonish rivalry that stayed mostly external to the family itself. This episode brings that same pattern home, distributing it across every single person living in the house, and then closing the story with the family choosing the easiest, least honest explanation available, rather than looking at what actually caused the damage sitting around them. Nobody in this episode changes because of what happened. Nobody apologizes in any meaningful way. The problem gets blamed on a screen, and life goes back to normal, ready to pick back up exactly where it left off. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One detail from inside this same episode deserves closer attention on its own, separate from everything else already covered here. The single attempt made during Lethal Weapons to bring in real outside help for the family's anger did not simply fail quietly in the background. It ended with the professional involved getting physically attacked during the appointment meant to help. That detail turns out to describe a pattern that reaches well beyond this one episode. Section 4. The psychologist who never stood a chance. Inside the chaos of Lethal Weapons, one detail gets buried under everything else happening around it. Lois takes Stewie to see a psychologist named Dr. Morin, hoping to figure out where his sudden violence toward Peter is actually coming from. It is a reasonable thing for a parent to do. A young child hitting an adult with a baseball bat is the kind of behavior that calls for outside help, not just a stern talking to at the dinner table. For one short scene, the episode looks like it might actually slow down and take that seriously. Then, Stewie attacks Dr. Morin during the session, and the moment passes without much comment from anyone in the family. Nobody follows up. Nobody tries a second appointment. The single attempt made in that entire episode to understand where Stewie's aggression comes from ends the same way almost everything else in the house does, with more violence instead of any real answer. That detail is easy to miss inside an episode packed with a citywide leaf tourist invasion, a black belt housewife, and an entire family brawl. Taken on its own, though, it says something worth stopping on. A show that spends so much time putting its characters through anger, fights, and full household meltdowns rarely lets any of its professional characters actually do their job. Doctors, psychologists, and counselors show up across the series again and again, usually introduced as the person who might finally help someone in the family understand themselves better. Almost every single time, something gets in the way before that can happen. Sometimes the professional gets hurt. Sometimes they get ignored. In at least one case, they end up dead. Dr. Morin is the first version of this pattern the show puts on screen, and it works specifically because of how ordinary the setup looks going in. Lois does not seem to see anything unusual about taking her son to a psychologist at the Quahog Child Psychology Center. This is not framed as some strange, over-the-top parenting decision. It reads as the normal, responsible thing for a mother to do after her child hits someone with a bat. The show sets the visit up as a completely reasonable response to a real problem, which makes the failure that follows land harder than it would if the visit itself had been played as a joke from the start. Once inside the appointment, the show does not spend much time on what Dr. Morin actually says or asks. The scene exists mainly to be interrupted. Stewie, sitting across from someone whose entire job is to understand what is going on inside his head, responds to that attention with an attack instead of a conversation. The session ends before it can produce anything close to insight, and the show moves on almost immediately to the next piece of chaos happening back at the Griffin house. There is no scene afterward where Lois discusses what happened with Peter. No follow-up appointment scheduled. No mention of the visit ever coming up again in the episode. It simply disappears, treated as one more failed attempt among many, no more significant than anything else going wrong that day. This pattern repeats itself in a much larger and more serious way in a later episode built entirely around a single therapy session. In that episode, Stewie gets sent to see a child psychologist named Dr. Cecil Pritchfield after pushing a classmate down a set of stairs at his preschool. The episode is unusually long by the show's normal standards and slows down in a way most Family Guy stories never do, spending almost its entire runtime inside one room, following a single extended conversation between Stewie and the doctor. At first, the session plays out the way most fictional therapy scenes tend to. Dr. Pritchfield tries to open Stewie up with small talk, and Stewie, annoyed that the doctor cannot pick up on the British accent he has spent years performing, tries to turn the conversation back onto him instead. He studies a photograph in the office and uses it to work out, with surprising accuracy, that Dr. Pritchfield is married to a much younger man and feels uneasy about the age difference between them. It is a sharp, uncomfortable move meant to throw the doctor off balance before he can get anywhere close to whatever Stewie might actually be avoiding. For a little while, it looks like Stewie might succeed in keeping the whole session about someone else. Then Dr. Pritchfield, calm and unbothered by the deflection, makes a simple observation. He tells Stewie that he seems like a very lonely young man. That one line breaks through everything Stewie has been building up to that point, and he suddenly starts crying, catching even himself off guard. For a brief stretch of the episode, real progress looks possible. Stewie talks about his loneliness, his sense of not fitting in anywhere, and eventually drops the fake accent he has maintained for years, admitting it has always been a way of covering up who he actually is. Dr. Pritchfield shares a little about his own difficult childhood, having lost his parents as a boy and grown up moving between different homes, drawing a quiet connection between his own past and what Stewie is describing about feeling like an outsider. For a show built almost entirely around jokes, this stretch of the episode plays as close to sincere as anything in its history. Then the moment passes. Faced with the idea of actually letting his true self be known and realizing that doing so would make him just another ordinary child rather than someone unusual and untouchable, Stewie pulls back. He picks the accent back up. He returns to the version of himself built to keep people at a distance rather than the one that just cried in front of a stranger. Right after that shift happens, Dr. Pritchfield begins having a heart attack. He asks Stewie to hand him his heart medication, sitting close by on a table in the room. Stewie does not do it. He understands in that moment that Dr. Pritchfield is now the only person who has seen the real him, the version underneath the accent and the persona. Rather than get him his medication and risk that truth becoming something the doctor might one day share, Stewie chooses to let him die. He sits and watches as the man who spent the last hour actually breaking through to him passes away in front of him, unable to get to the pills, sitting only a short distance out of reach. Right afterward, the doctor's husband leaves a phone message asking for a divorce, unaware his partner has already died, adding one more layer of sadness to a scene the show plays with almost no comedy at all. The episode does not let this pass without consequence for Stewie, at least not entirely. In its final moments, he wakes up from a nightmare, clearly shaken, and tells Brian that he has done something terrible without being willing to explain what it was. It is a small, quiet ending for an episode that spent almost its entire length inside one room, and it suggests that some part of Stewie understands exactly what he chose to do, even if he cannot bring himself to say it out loud. That detail matters because it separates this moment from most of the other failed interventions covered so far in this video. Peter walks away from his fights with Ernie without a second thought. The family blames television instead of themselves at the end of Lethal Weapons. Here at least, something appears to land. understand. Stewie does not seem proud of what happened. He seems disturbed by it, even if he still is not ready to face it directly. Placed next to each other, these two therapy scenes tell a fuller version of the same story. In the first one, early in the show's run, a professional trying to understand where a child's aggression comes from gets physically attacked before any real conversation can happen. The show moves on right away, treating the failure as background noise inside a much bigger episode. In the second one, years later, a professional actually succeeds where the first one could not. He gets past Stewie's defenses, reaches something real and painful underneath them, and for a moment, real change looks possible. Then, at the exact point where that success could have meant something lasting, it gets erased completely. Not through another sudden burst of temper, but through a quiet, deliberate choice to let a dying man go unhelped in order to protect a secret. The two scenes represent different kinds of failure, but they point toward the same underlying pattern. Getting close to real insight into a family member's aggression does not lead anywhere lasting in this show, whether the block is a violent interruption or a much colder kind of self-protection. Dr. Morin failed because Stewie's reaction to being examined was immediate and physical. Dr. Pritchfield failed because he actually succeeded, got dangerously close to something true, and paid for that success with his life. In both cases, the person meant to help walks away from the encounter worse off than before it started, while the person they were trying to help returns to exactly who they were before the session began. This says something worth sitting with about how the show treats the idea of getting real help for anger and aggression. Both scenes suggest, in very different ways, that understanding where this behavior comes from is either physically dangerous to attempt or too threatening to allow once someone gets close to the answer. Dr. Morin never even gets the chance to ask a real follow-up question before the appointment turns violent. Dr. Pritchfield gets much further, close enough to produce actual tears and a real confession, and it is precisely that closeness that puts him in danger. The show never states this idea directly through any character's own words. It simply keeps building scenes where it plays out the same way, twice, across more than 15 years of episodes, using two completely different characters and two very different kinds of therapists. None of this suggests the writers sat down with a plan to make a specific point about therapy failing every family member who tries it. Family Guy is built around fast, often disconnected jokes, and both of these scenes work first as comedy, even the second one, which shifts into something closer to tragedy by its final minutes. But a pattern repeated this clearly across this much time tends to mean something, whether or not it was mapped out on purpose from the start. Every time a professional gets close to actually helping a member of this family deal with their anger, something stops that help from taking hold. Sometimes it is a bat to the head. Sometimes it is a heart attack left untreated on purpose. Either way, the person doing the helping ends up hurt, and the person meant to be helped goes right back to who they already were. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That pattern does not stay limited to outside professionals brought in from beyond the family. It shows up just as clearly inside the family itself, in the relationship between Stewie and the one person his anger has been aimed at longer and more consistently than anyone else he has ever crossed paths with, including every psychologist who has ever tried to sit across from him. Section 5. A toddler's 20-year war on his mother. Stewie Griffin enters Family Guy in the very first episode ever made, called Death Has a Shadow, which first aired on January 31st, 1999. From his earliest appearances, the show gives him a personality that has almost nothing to do with being a baby. He speaks in full, complicated sentences, using an upper-class British accent and a vocabulary far beyond anything a real one-year-old could manage. He walks and reasons like a grown adult trapped inside an infant's body, complete with a large football-shaped head that becomes one of his most recognizable features. Underneath all of that polish sits something much darker than a simple joke about a baby who who talks like a professor. According to the character's own official history, Stewie began the series as a sociopath obsessed with world domination, violence, and, most importantly for this section, the act of killing his own mother. That last detail is not exaggeration or fan interpretation. It is stated plainly as part of who the character was built to be from the beginning. Stewie's desire to kill Lois is described as one of his most defining and consistent traits across the show's early years. Driven by a specific piece of internal logic the show sets up early and returns to many times. Lois, without ever realizing it, keeps getting in the way of Stewie's various plans and schemes simply by doing normal parenting. She feeds him, disciplines him, keeps him from wandering off, and generally acts like any mother would toward a very young child. Stewie experiences all of that ordinary parenting as constant interference standing between him and whatever plan for control or destruction he happens to be working on that week. In his mind, removing her is not an emotional decision built from anger or resentment in any way a normal person would recognize it. It reads as a practical solution to an ongoing problem, the same way a person might get frustrated by a broken tool and decide the easiest fix is simply to replace it. What makes this setup work as comedy rather than as something genuinely disturbing is the total mismatch between Stewie's intentions and his actual ability to carry them out. He builds elaborate weapons and devices meant to cope with everyday baby frustrations, things like teething pain or being forced to eat broccoli, and just as easily turns those same tools toward far more serious purposes, including his repeated attempts on Lois's life. Every single one of these attempts fails. Lois moves through most of the show's run completely unaware that her toddler son has spent years actively plotting her death. Brian is the only member of the household who knows the full truth, and he chooses not to tell her, partly because bringing it up would make him sound completely unstable to everyone around him, and partly because he has watched Stewie fail at this so many times that he genuinely doubts his roommate and best friend will ever actually succeed. One clear early example of this pattern shows up in a season 2 episode called The Story on Page 1. Rather than attempt anything directly himself, Stewie builds a mind-controlled device and uses it on his older brother Chris, taking away Chris's own free will entirely and turning him into a tool for his own purposes. The end goal of that control is exactly what it always is with Stewie during this period of the show, using someone else's size and strength to finally accomplish the matricide he cannot manage on his own as an infant. The plan collapses in a way that fits the character perfectly. The device short-circuits the moment Chris gets too close to a microwave, ending the scheme before it can go any further, and leaving both Chris and Lois completely unharmed, and, just as importantly, completely unaware of how close things actually came to going a very different way. This particular failure captures something important about how the show chooses to write these attempts across the years that follow. Stewie is never shown as clumsy or incompetent in a way that makes him harmless. His plans are usually clever, sometimes genuinely impressive for a character his size, built with real engineering and real strategy behind them. What stops him almost every time is something small and mundane getting in the way at exactly the wrong moment, the same way a random microwave interrupts a mind control plot that otherwise might have worked. The show never lets Stewie succeed through pure luck stopping him either. Something ordinary, something almost boring, keeps breaking his plans apart right at the final step, over and over, across dozens of episodes spread across several years. That repetition builds its own kind of quiet tension underneath the comedy. Every time Stewie tries again, the audience already knows how the attempt is going to end, since the show has trained viewers to expect failure through years of the same basic joke playing out in different forms. That expectation becomes part of what makes the eventual break from the pattern land as hard as it does. does. For years, Stewie's war against his mother functions as a running gag, with no real weight behind it, since nobody ever actually gets hurt and Lois never even learns the war exists. The show spends a long time building up exactly that kind of comfortable, low-stakes rhythm before deciding at a very specific and clearly marked point in its run to finally break it. That break arrives at the show's 100th episode, a milestone Seth MacFarlane chose to mark with something far more serious than another failed plot involving a homemade device. Before the episode aired, he told audiences directly that this particular installment would include an actual death, a rare piece of advance information for a show that otherwise tends to let its biggest moments arrive as surprises. The two-part story built around that promise is called Stewie Kills Lois, followed immediately by Lois Kills Stewie, and both parts aired in November 2007, arriving back-to-back 1 week apart as part of the show's 6th season. The story begins on ordinary ground, with the Griffin family gathered to celebrate Lois's birthday. Among her gifts, Brian gives her a pair of tickets for a luxury cruise, intended as a relaxing getaway. Lois, excited by the idea, decides to invite Peter along with her rather than bringing Stewie, a decision that seems completely reasonable from her side and carries no ill intent whatsoever. From Stewie's side, the choice lands very differently. He feels excluded and resentful, reading Lois's decision as one more example of her favoring Peter over him, and that resentment is enough to reignite the matricidal drive that has been sitting mostly dormant, at least as a serious threat, for years of episodes up to this point. What follows is not framed as a sudden emotional outburst, the way most of Peter's anger has been throughout this video so far. Stewie's response is calm, deliberate, and openly declared out loud before he ever acts on it. He tells Brian directly that he intends to kill Lois the moment she returns from the cruise, and when Brian responds the way he always has, reminding Stewie of every past attempt that has ended in failure and predicting this one will go exactly the same way, Stewie treats that skepticism as a personal challenge rather than a reasonable warning. He sets out specifically to prove Brian wrong, framing the entire plan as much around winning that argument as around Lois herself. This time, the preparation matches the seriousness of the goal. Stewie acquires a real submachine gun, a step well beyond the homemade gadgets and mind control devices used in his earlier attempts. He rents a speedboat, using it to get close enough to the cruise ship to board it without being noticed by the people running the trip. Everything about the planning reflects someone who has learned from years of failure and adjusted accordingly, trading clever but fragile inventions for a plan built around brute, direct force instead. Once aboard, Stewie carries out the attack, and the episode presents the outcome as final. Lois appears to be shot and killed while on the cruise. The show does not shy away from this moment or soften it into something more comedic than it plays on screen, giving the moment real, dramatic weight, rather than treating it as another lighthearted failure. For anyone who has watched the character's pattern build across the previous 100 episodes, this represents the exact opposite of everything the show has trained its audience to expect. The gag that always ends in failure ends, this time, in what looks like complete and total success. The episode does not end there, instead following what happens to the Griffin family across the year that follows Lois's apparent death. Peter begins dating again during this stretch, going out with a range of unusual partners that fit the show's typical sense of humor, including, at one point, even Bonnie, a neighbor and close friend of the family. In a detail that captures the show's willingness to push a joke into genuinely uncomfortable territory, Peter also convinces his friend Joe to occasionally dress and act as Lois around the house, hoping this will spare his son Chris from the emotional damage of fully processing his mother's death. Underneath all of that, the true story behind Lois's death starts working its way back toward the surface. Stewie, without meaning to, indirectly reveals to Brian that he actually did kill her, confirming what Brian had spent years assuming would never actually happen. Brian's reaction breaks sharply from his usual detached, cynical response to Stewie's schemes. He becomes genuinely disturbed and angry and vows to expose what Stewie has done rather than continue keeping his secret the way he always has in the past. Realizing how much danger he is now in, Stewie tries to cover his tracks, disposing of the gun used in the shooting along with drawings he had made depicting Lois being killed, treating physical evidence he once kept almost as trophies, as something suddenly too dangerous to hold on to any longer. The investigation that follows does not point towards Stewie at all, and this becomes one of the darker pieces of irony running through the episode. Peter, entirely by accident, reveals that Lois's life insurance policy was taken out during the cruise itself, shortly after an argument the two of them had, in which both of them expressed, in the heat of the moment, a wish that the other one were dead. That detail, combined with the timing of the payout being recently cashed, is more than enough to make his friends Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland suspect that Peter himself is responsible for his wife's death. Their search eventually leads them through the family's own garbage, where they find the gun and drawings Stewie had thrown away, seemingly confirming their suspicion, since the handwriting on the drawings closely resembles Peter's own. By the end of this half of the story, the Griffin family sits inside a situation built almost entirely out of misplaced blame and hidden truth. Lois appears to be dead. Peter, completely innocent of the actual killing, stands accused because of a string of coincidences involving money, timing, and an argument that meant nothing more than two frustrated people saying something they did not truly intend. Stewie, the one person actually responsible, has managed to disappear from suspicion almost entirely, protected by nothing more than bad luck landing on someone else instead of him. Brian alone knows the real truth, now carrying a secret heavier than anything he has held on to in all his years of watching Stewie's failed plans unfold before this one. This entire storyline represents the clearest, most serious escalation of anger covered anywhere so far in this video. Every other example up to this point, from the chicken feud to the family brawl in Lethal Weapons to Stewie's earlier failed attempts on Lois's life, eventually resets back to something close to normal, usually within the same episode or very shortly afterward. Stewie kills Lois, refuses to offer that same quick reset. It lets a plan built entirely from years of unresolved resentment finally reach its intended target. And it lets the consequences of that plan spread outward across an entire year of the family's life, touching Peter, Brian, Chris, and the wider circle of friends investigating what happened, long after the initial act itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of what has been described so far explains how the family, and the show itself, eventually found its way back from a premise this serious. Lois's apparent death, the accusation hanging over Peter, and the secret sitting inside Brian all lead directly into a resolution built around one of the strangest twists the show has ever used. One that changes the meaning of everything covered in this section without erasing what any of it revealed about Stewie's anger in the first place. Section 6. The Simulation. Peter, Lois, Stewie. The story left off with Lois seemingly dead, Peter wrongly suspected of her murder, and Stewie sitting almost completely outside of suspicion, despite being the one person actually responsible. The second half of this story, called Lois Kills Stewie, picks up by finally explaining what really happened to Lois after the shooting on the cruise, and the explanation turns out to be almost as strange as everything building up to it. Lois was not actually killed during the attack. She survived being shot and ended up rescued at sea by a character the show describes as a reverse merman, a strange, over-the-top detail that fits the kind of humor the series leans on even inside its more serious storylines. The injury and the shock of what happened left her with amnesia, wiping away her memory of who she was or where she belonged. She wandered for months with no clear direction, eventually landing at a fat camp in North Carolina with the joke name Camp Put Down at a Forca, where she was hired as a counselor to help keep the kids there from turning on each other out of hunger and frustration. Her memory eventually returns through another unlikely turn of events. While at the camp, Lois meets and starts spending time with a man who seems friendly and kind at first, only for it to come out that he is actually a white supremacist. He brings her along to one of his group's gatherings, and when she speaks out against what she hears there, an angry angry member of the crowd throws a bottle that strikes her in the head. The blow knocks her memory back into place. She remembers who she is, what happened to her, and rushes back home to Quahog to confront the truth about what happened on that cruise. Her return sets off the second half of the story almost immediately. As soon as she finishes explaining everything that happened to her, the family realizes Stewie has slipped away and disappeared. Joe organizes a search through town to track him down, but the effort turns up nothing. When the family finally makes it back to their own house, they find Stewie already waiting for them there, holding a real handgun, calm and fully in control of the situation despite being only a toddler. What follows is one of the most serious moments the show has ever put on screen involving Stewie directly. Knowing that his secret is no longer safe, now that the family understands what he actually did, he ties them down in the living room to keep them from interfering with whatever comes next. When Cleveland walks in casually, having no idea what has just unfolded inside the house, Stewie shoots and kills him right in front of the rest of the family. The show does not treat this as a punchline. It plays the moment with the same weight it would carry in a straightforward drama, letting the horror of what just happened sit on screen for a beat before moving forward. Stewie, thinking through his next move with the same coldness he showed toward the CIA plot years earlier, decides that neither the police nor the press are likely to take much notice of a missing black man, and uses that assumption to justify continuing forward with his plan rather than worrying about consequences from Cleveland's death. From there, Stewie forces Brian to drive him to the headquarters of the CIA. The two of them pose as agents to get inside, and once there, Stewie gains access to the agency's central supercomputer. Using that system, he seizes control of the entire planet's power grid, giving him leverage over every country connected to it. Faced with the choice of losing electricity worldwide or giving in to his demands, the CIA submits, and Stewie declares himself president of the world, a title that, inside the story, actually holds. The scale of what happens next goes well beyond anything covered earlier in this video. Stewie broadcasts a set of oppressive new laws from the White House, seen and heard by people across the entire planet, including familiar faces from the Griffin's own circle like Quagmire, Joe, Bonnie, and Mayor Adam West. Even characters from the animated series American Dad, Stan Smith and Avery Bullock, attempt to step in and stop him, only to find themselves completely powerless against the threat of a worldwide blackout hanging over their heads. Every attempt made by anyone with real institutional power fails to slow Stewie down in any way. It is Lois, not any government or agency, who finally moves to stop him. Watching her infant son declare himself ruler of the planet after already killing a close family friend pushes her past patience and into direct action. She confronts him, and the two of them end up in an extended, carefully staged fight, described by reviewers at the time as one of the more elaborate and physically demanding action sequences the show had produced up to that point. Mother and son, locked in genuine combat, each trying to overpower the other with real intent behind it. At the peak of that fight, Lois manages to get the upper hand over Stewie, putting herself in a position where she could end things completely. She hesitates. Whatever anger and fear the last several minutes have built inside her, something deeper stops her from following through. An instinct tied directly to being his mother rather than to being someone protecting a family or a planet. That hesitation becomes the exact moment where the story turns. In the confusion of the fight, Peter, holding a gun during the struggle, fires it by accident. The shot hits Stewie in the head. His plan for world domination, his war against Lois, and his short reign as ruler of the planet all end in the same instant. Cut off by a stray shot fired by his own father, rather than by anything Lois herself chose to do. Lois, rather than feeling any relief or victory, is left devastated, holding her son's body as the full weight of what just happened sets in. For a show that has spent years building toward this exact confrontation, ending it this way lands as a genuine gut punch. Stewie's original desire to remove Lois from his life reaches its final form here, only for the person actually stopped in the end to be Stewie himself, and by accident rather than by design. design. It is the single most serious, most consequential turn the anger explored throughout this video has ever taken. A death, a grieving parent. A story that finally seems ready to leave its characters permanently changed by what has happened between them. Then the show pulls the entire foundation out from under everything that just happened. Brian walks into the room where the device Stewie has been using this whole time is located and finds Stewie stepping out of it, alive and unharmed. Everything that occurred across both halves of this story, from Lois's apparent death on the cruise all the way through the shooting that seemingly ended Stewie's life, is revealed to have taken place entirely inside a computer simulation. Stewie built the program using the same CIA supercomputer featured inside the story itself, running the entire sequence as a kind of test to see exactly how his plan to kill Lois and take over the world would actually play out in reality before attempting any of it for real. Brian, taking in the scale of what he just watched unfold, compares the whole thing to an unusually vivid dream, a fairly reasonable reaction given everything he just witnessed. Stewie tells Brian plainly that things did not go well for him inside the simulation, and that his plans for both matricide and world domination will have to wait as a result. Watching an entire imagined version of his life play out to its worst possible ending, complete with Cleveland's death, a global takeover that still ended in failure, and his own accidental death at his father's hand, appears to be enough to convince him, at least for the time being, that neither goal is worth pursuing any further. Rather than keep the program around, he chooses to delete it entirely, closing the door on the exact fantasy that has driven so much of his character up to this point in the show's run. The episode does not let this reveal pass without acknowledging how strange a choice it is from a storytelling standpoint. Brian and Stewie talk directly about how a twist built entirely around an imaginary sequence might frustrate people watching at home, with Stewie describing the reveal as something close to an insult aimed at the audience for investing in a story that, in the end, did not actually happen. He follows that comment by noting, with some pride, that at least this ending did not cut off in the middle of a sentence, the way the television series The Sopranos famously ended its own run. Right as he finishes making that comparison, the screen cuts to black mid-sentence, doing exactly what he just claimed the episode avoided. It is a small, self-aware joke, closing out one of the show's most serious storylines with a wink directed squarely at anyone who noticed how unusual the whole structure of the episode actually was. Life for the Griffin family resets almost completely once the simulation ends. Brian arrives holding postcards sent by Peter and Lois, confirming that the real version of their cruise, the one referenced at the very start of the first episode, went smoothly the entire time, with no shooting, no amnesia, and no confrontation of any kind. Everything the audience spent 2 full episodes watching happened only inside Stewie's imagination, tested and discarded before it ever touched the real world at all. Critics reviewing these episodes when they first aired responded with a mix of praise and skepticism that reflects just how unusual this structure really was. The entertainment site IGN rated the first half of the story a 9 out of 10, and the second half even higher at 9.4 out of 10, specifically praising how the story balanced genuine tension, courtroom scenes, and dramatic stakes with the show's usual style of humor, including smaller touches like a birthday gift involving singer Lionel Richie and a well-placed cameo from the Kool-Aid Man. Other reviewers were more mixed. One writer for TV Squad found the first half disjointed, criticizing it for leaning too heavily on cutaway jokes and flashbacks rather than building a clear story, though that same reviewer responded far more positively to the second half once the full picture came together. A reviewer for the AV Club rated the first episode highly, but noted it felt somewhat unusual for the show to build an entire structure around Stewie's long-running desire to kill his mother, given how the show had mostly moved away from leaning heavily on that trait in earlier seasons. That same reviewer praised the extended fight sequence between Lois and Stewie as a technical highlight, while also pointing out that the eventual reveal of everything Gang being a simulation felt fairly predictable by the time it actually arrived. Looking back at these two episodes together, from Lois's actual survival and eventual return home, through Stewie's takeover of the entire planet, and finally to the reveal that erases almost everything the audience just watched, the story ends up mirroring the exact pattern already seen throughout the rest of this video, just built on a much larger scale than anything covered earlier. Stewie's anger reaches its absolute peak here. He kills a close family friend. He seizes control of the world. He comes as close as the show has ever allowed to actually succeeding at removing his mother entirely. And then, through a twist built specifically to undo everything that just happened, none of it actually took place at all. No character is left permanently changed by any of it. No real consequence survives past the final minutes of the second episode. The single largest expression of anger the show has ever built turns out to be the easiest one to erase completely, folded away into a simulation, and deleted the moment it stops being useful. Fans looking back on this story years later have often treated it as a kind of closing chapter for that specific side of Stewie's character, the version of him defined mainly by his war against his mother. Some longtime viewers point to these two episodes as the last real, meaningful use of that particular running gag, arguing that once the show gave the storyline this kind of full, dramatic conclusion, even one immediately undone by a twist, there was little reason left to keep returning to it the same way in future seasons. That reading turns out to be mostly accurate. The show did move away from treating Stewie's desire to kill Lois as a serious, ongoing plot after this point, letting the idea fade into occasional references rather than active storylines. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That shift raises a question this video has not answered yet. If Stewie's war against his mother effectively ends here, at least as a storyline the show takes seriously, what was actually driving it in the first place? For close to 20 years after these episodes aired, the show never gave a direct answer. That eventually changed in a much quieter, much more recent episode that finally let Stewie say, out loud and without any elaborate scheme sitting underneath it, exactly why he wanted his mother gone to begin with. Section 7, 27 years later, an explanation. For nearly the entire history of Family Guy, one small technical detail sat quietly underneath every scene involving Stewie. The audience could always hear him speaking in full, complicated English, delivered in his precise British accent. Almost nobody inside the show itself could understand a word of it. To Lois, to Peter, and to most of the adults around him, Stewie sounds like an ordinary baby, making baby noises, rather than clever, sometimes disturbing observations about the people around him. Only a small number of characters were ever given the ability to understand him clearly, starting with Brian, and later expanded in earlier seasons to include Chris and Meg as well. Lois, the one person Stewie spent the show's earliest years trying to kill, was never part of that group. For 27 years, mother and son existed side by side without ever having a single conversation either one of them could actually follow. That barrier held all the way through the events covered in the last two sections. Stewie could plan, threaten, and even carry out an entire fictional murder of his mother inside a computer simulation, and Lois would never hear a single word of it in a form she could understand. The two of them could stand in the same room, day after day, year after year, with an entire hidden history of resentment and violence sitting between them, invisible to the one person it was aimed at the whole time. That silence is not a small detail. It is part of what made the earlier storylines land the way they did. A mother who cannot hear her son's true feelings toward her has no way of ever addressing them, which means every attempt at resolution up to this point could only happen through action rather than conversation, whether that action was a failed kidnapping plot, a staged fight, or a simulated shooting on a cruise ship. That barrier finally came down in the 450th episode of the show's run, called The Edible Arrangement, which served as the premiere of season 24 and first aired on February 15th, 2026. The episode opens with the grand opening of Quahog's first legal recreational marijuana dispensary, a plot detail that sets up everything that follows. Brian, taking full advantage of the new store, buys a supply of marijuana gummies and stores them in the family pantry, without much thought about who else might come across them. That small decision sets off the rest of the story. Stewie, sneaking around the kitchen looking for a box of Oreo cookies Lois had bought earlier, ends up eating some of Brian's gummies by mistake, believing them to be ordinary candy. He gets high almost immediately, and the effects are noticed at daycare by his teacher, a character named Miss Tammy. Once the school realizes what happened, Stewie is sent home, and Lois briefly loses custody of him while the situation gets sorted out, sent to complete online parenting courses before she is allowed to have him back living at home. In the meantime, Stewie stays temporarily with Joe and Bonnie Swanson next door, spending part of that stretch mildly annoyed by Joe's habit of delivering political commentary at every opportunity. Once Lois regains custody, she responds the way many worried parents might, setting a long list of new safety rules meant to prevent anything like this from happening again. Those rules end up frustrating almost everyone in the house. Peter fails to follow several of them correctly, and Meg ends up leaving town rather than deal with the new restrictions at all. Stewie, feeling boxed in by all of it, decides to get high again on purpose, and this time he does not stop with himself. He slips some of the same gummies into Lois's wine, apparently hoping it might help her relax and ease up on the household rules she has just put in place. What happens next is the moment the entire episode was built around. Once the gummies take effect, Lois and Stewie discover, almost by accident, that they can suddenly understand each other perfectly. For the first time in the show's entire history, an actual two-way conversation becomes possible between them, and the two of them waste no time diving into it. Stewie points out something he has apparently noticed for a long time without ever having a way to say it out loud, telling Lois that Peter treats her poorly and does very little around the house to help out. Lois responds honestly rather than defensively, admitting that she is aware of the situation and has more or less made peace with it, reasoning, half joking and half serious, that Peter is likely to pass away eventually anyway, at which point a trust fund she has access to will finally kick in. It is a dark, oddly practical piece of honesty from a character who almost never gets the chance to speak this plainly about her own marriage. The conversation between them continues to widen from there, moving through different corners of family life neither of them has ever had the chance to discuss directly before. At one point during the night, the two of them go out together, ending up at an all-night pancake restaurant, where they treat their waitress with real kindness, after realizing she is working several jobs at once just to get by, quietly choosing not to complain when she brings out an order that does not match what they asked for. Earlier in the night, they also get a small, petty piece of revenge on their neighbor Bonnie for an earlier comment Lois found condescending, defecating on the Swansons' front lawn together as a kind of shared, slightly ridiculous bonding moment between mother and son. The center of the episode, though, is the moment Stewie finally explains, out loud and without any scheme sitting behind it, why he wanted to kill Lois in the first place, all the way back at the very start of the series. According to the explanation he gives her, the root of it was never really about Lois herself as a person. It came from what he saw when he looked at her. He describes Lois as someone who lets the rest of the family walk over her, someone who has spent years accepting disrespect from Peter and everyone else in the house without pushing back. Watching that pattern play out, Stewie explains, frightened him, not because he pitied her, but because he recognized something in her that he was afraid might also exist inside himself. Killing her, in his mind at the time, was never framed as an act of hatred toward Lois specifically. It was closer to trying to remove a weakness he was terrified of carrying inside his own personality, using Lois as the closest available target for a fear that was really about himself the entire time. That explanation reframes almost everything covered in the last two sections of this video. The elaborate mind control devices, the homemade weapons, the submachine gun and speedboat used in the fake cruise ship shooting, the entire simulated takeover of the planet. None of it was ever really about punishing Lois for something she had done to him. It was about a very young, very frightened version of Stewie trying to destroy a trait he saw in his mother before that same trait could take hold in him. He tells Lois this plainly, without hiding behind his usual sharp, detached sense of humor. And for a moment, the two of them sit inside something that looks almost nothing like the rest of the show's history together. Lois's reaction to hearing this confession says just as much as the confession itself. Rather than pulling away from her son after learning that he spent years of his early life actively plotting to kill her, she stays with him in the conversation, eventually telling him that she loves him without any condition attached to that love, confession and all. It is a strange kind of forgiveness, offered to a version of events that, until this exact night, she never even knew existed. 27 years of hidden history gets acknowledged and accepted inside a single, unusually honest conversation, made possible only because both of them happened to be under the influence of the same marijuana gummies at the same time. The people responsible for building this episode were open in interviews given around the time it aired about exactly how deliberate this choice was. According to the show's longtime co-showrunners, Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, the idea for the episode did not start out this way at all. The original plan involved Peter getting high with Stewie instead of Lois, framed as a simple, fun buddy comedy between father and son. It was only once the writers stopped to consider who actually carries the most complicated emotional history with Stewie that they realized the far more meaningful version of this story belonged to Lois, given everything already built up across the 2 decades of matricide plots, fake deaths, and simulated killings covered earlier in this video. Once that shift happened, the writers apparently knew almost immediately that they had found something worth building an entire milestone episode around. That instinct was tested well before the episode ever aired. According to Appel, the cast performed a live table read of the script at the Paley Center as part of the show's 25th anniversary celebration back in 2024, nearly 2 years before the episode actually reached television. When the read reached the exact moment where Lois and Stewie first realized they can understand each other, the audience in the room responded with a loud, immediate wave of approval, confirming for the writers that longtime fans of the show recognized exactly how significant this particular moment would be inside the much larger history of the series. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois since the show's very first episode, spoke about the experience of recording this particular story in personal terms. She described the scene where Stewie explains his reasons for wanting her dead as reaching something close to the emotional core of the entire relationship, drawing a direct comparison to her own experience raising a teenage son in real life. After voicing the character for over 450 episodes, she noted that a script like this one still managed to reveal parts of Lois she had never fully explored before, describing the whole experience as opening a door that the show could potentially return to again in future stories. Despite how much weight the episode places on this conversation, the show does not let any of it stick permanently. By the next morning, once the gummies wear off completely, Lois and Stewie return to being exactly who they were before any of it happened. They retain only a faint, hazy memory of the night, nothing close to a full, lasting understanding of everything they said to each other. The very last moments of the episode make this especially clear. Lois once again refuses Stewie's request for an Oreo cookie and buys the same brand of baby wipes he has always hated, and Stewie, right back to his usual self, responds by vowing to kill her again, closing the episode on almost the exact same note the show opened on nearly 3 decades earlier. The show's own writers addressed this choice directly as well, explaining that allowing Lois to understand Stewie permanently was never really on the table, even after building an entire milestone episode around the idea. According to Appel, Part of what makes Stewie and Lois's lack of communication valuable to the show is the very fact that it has never changed. Unlike the earlier decision to let Chris understand Stewie as a lasting, permanent shift in the show's rules. Keeping this one relationship locked in place, he explained, protects something special about it, especially now that a large share of the show's audience watches through streaming services, often picking episodes out of order rather than following the series from the beginning, the way earlier generations of fans did. Taken together, everything inside this episode adds a layer to Stewie's anger that none of the earlier sections in this video had access to. The chicken fights covered near the start of this video showed anger with no explanation behind it at all, arriving instantly over something as small as an expired coupon. Stewie's war against his mother, covered just before this section, looked for years like it might work the exact same way, driven by nothing more than convenience and irritation at being interfered with. This episode finally gives that specific thread of anger a real foundation, tracing it back to fear rather than simple frustration, and fear rooted in Stewie's own view of himself, rather than in anything Lois actually did to deserve it. It does not excuse any of what came before it. It does explain, for the first time in the show's entire history, where that particular anger actually came from underneath all the schemes built on top of it. That kind of explanation stands out because almost nothing else in this video has offered one. Peter's anger toward Ernie the chicken never gets a deeper reason attached to it. The family brawl covered earlier in this video ends with the household blaming television rather than looking at anything real. Stewie's confession in this episode is the closest thing the show has ever offered to an honest answer for why any of its characters carry the anger they do. And even then, the show makes sure that answer disappears again by morning, leaving Stewie exactly where he started. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Peter's own anger never received anything close to this kind of explanation across the 20-plus seasons the show has produced so far. Instead of tracing back to a single clear fear the way Stewie's did, his temper simply changed shape over time, growing sharper and harder to laugh off the longer the show stayed on the air, aimed most often at the one member of his own family least equipped to push back against it. Section 8. How Peter's anger changed shape over 20 seasons. Every example covered so far in this video shows anger that resets. Peter fights Ernie the chicken and walks away unchanged. The whole family brawls in Lethal Weapons and blames the television instead of themselves. Stewie plots against Lois for years, gets a real explanation for it decades later, and forgets that explanation by the next morning. One relationship inside the Griffin house does not follow that same looping pattern. The way Peter treats his daughter Meg does not simply repeat itself the same way from season to season. According to people who have tracked the character closely across the show's full run, it actually changes shape over time, growing sharper for a long stretch of years before eventually easing back again much later. To see that change clearly, it helps to start with how Peter is written in the show's earliest years. Reference material describing his character across the full run of the series notes that in the earlier seasons, Peter comes across mainly as a charming, dim-witted father who means well most of the time and shows real affection toward his children, Meg included. He is careless. He is often selfish in small, forgivable ways. He is not, in these early years, written as someone who deliberately targets one of his own children more harshly than the others for no clear reason. That description matters because it sets up a clear before and after point, and according to that same character history, the turn happens at a specific episode called Model Misbehavior. This episode is the 10th episode of Season 4, and it first aired on July 24th, 2005. Its main plot follows Lois as she chases an old teenage dream of becoming a model, encouraged by Peter after her photograph appears in the local newspaper. Lois finds quick success in the modeling world, though the glamour eventually starts costing her health, and Peter grows increasingly jealous of the attention other men begin paying her as her career takes off. Buried inside that main storyline is a much smaller scene that ends up defining the whole episode's lasting reputation. When Lois first announces her plan to become a model, Peter reacts the way he often reacts to anything involving her body, joking that he intends to look at her future photographs in a private, inappropriate way. Chris, following his father's lead without thinking twice about it, says he plans to do the exact same thing. Meg, sitting right there and clearly trying to fit in with the rest of the family rather than stand out as the one who reacts differently, echoes the same joke a moment later. What happens immediately afterward is the part of the scene that ends up mattering most. When Chris makes the comment, Peter shows no real reaction at all, letting it pass without comment or consequence. The instant Meg repeats the same words, Peter turns on her completely, calling what she said sick, reminding her that the woman in question is her own mother, as though that distinction had somehow escaped both of his children equally, rather than only the daughter now standing in front of him. Meg tries to explain herself, telling him she was only trying to fit in with everyone else in the room. Peter does not accept that explanation. He orders her out of the house, and when she does not move fast enough for his liking, he punches a wall and shouts at her again to leave immediately. The unevenness in that moment is not a small detail buried inside a busy episode. It is the entire point people bring up when discussing this scene years later. Chris makes the identical joke, word for word, in spirit if not in exact phrasing, and faces no punishment whatsoever. Meg makes the same joke and gets thrown out of her own home, watching her father put his fist through a wall in anger directed squarely at her. Nothing about the joke itself changes between the two deliveries. What changes is who says it, and Peter's reaction shifts entirely based on that one detail rather than on anything meaningfully different about what was actually said. This scene produced a line that has stayed attached to the show ever since. Later in the same episode, once Meg has clearly worked her way back into the house despite being told to leave, Peter's response to seeing her there again became one of the most repeated moments in the show's history, delivered as a sharp, dismissive question about who had allowed her back inside in the first place. According to reference material tracking widely repeated phrases from the show, this exact moment is the origin point for that particular line, which went on to spread well beyond the episode itself and became one of the most recognized examples of how the show treats this character specifically. A viewer reviewing the episode years after it originally aired captured the uncomfortable double nature of that moment fairly directly, describing the line as their favorite moment in the entire episode, while also admitting in the same breath that it was hurtful as much as it was funny. That kind of reaction, finding a moment simultaneously funny and cruel, sits at the center of why this particular episode gets singled out so often when people trace the show's treatment of Meg across its run. The joke works as comedy specifically because of how sharp and disproportionate Peter's reaction is. That same sharpness is also what makes the scene sting in a way most of the show's other jokes do not. None of this exists in isolation. According to broader character summaries built by people who have gone through the show's full run looking specifically at how Peter treats his family, this episode marks a turning point rather than a one-time exception. The same summaries describe a clear shift beginning around this stretch of the show, where Peter's treatment of Meg becomes noticeably harsher and more consistent over time than it had been in the earliest seasons. Where early Peter is remembered as affectionate toward all three of his children, despite his general carelessness, later seasons are described as showing a father who singles Meg out specifically, often for things her siblings do without consequence, mirroring exactly what plays out across this one scene in model misbehavior. This pattern stands apart from everything else in this video, precisely because it does not simply repeat itself the same way every time, the way the chicken fights or the family brawls tend to. According to people who have followed the show closely across its full run, the unfair treatment of Meg intensifies gradually across the seasons that follow this episode, becoming sharper and more frequent rather than staying at one fixed level. That kind of change is different from a loop. A loop like the chicken feud, resets completely each time and never actually moves forward or backward in intensity. This pattern, by contrast, appears to build on itself over the years, according to the people who have tracked it, growing worse across a long stretch of the show's run, before something eventually shifts it back the other way. That eventual shift is worth noting as clearly as the original turn, since it complicates any simple version of this story. According to the same character summaries describing Peter's harsher treatment of Meg across the middle years of the show, later seasons bring some amount of course correction. Specific mentions point to seasons 15, 16, 20, and 21 as periods where the show begins actively working to repair the relationship between Peter and Meg, gradually dialing back the sharper edges that had built up across the years before. This does not undo everything that came before it, and the reference material describing this shift is careful not to claim otherwise. It does show that this particular thread of Peter's anger, unlike almost everything else covered in this video so far, is not locked into a fixed, repeating shape from the show's first season all the way through to its most recent one. Placed next to the chicken feud and the family-wide brawl covered earlier in this video, the treatment of Meg reveals something different about how Peter's anger actually works underneath the show's usual jokes. The chicken feud shows anger with no real target beyond whoever happens to be standing across from him at the time, expressed the exact same way regardless of who Ernie is or what specifically set the fight off on any given occasion. The anger aimed at Meg is not like that. It depends heavily on who is standing in front of him. The same words from Chris produce nothing. Those same words from Meg produce a punch through a wall and an order to leave the house. That is not random, undirected anger, the way a fist fight with a giant chicken tends to be. It is anger that seems to know exactly who it is allowed to land on, choosing its target with a consistency the show's other examples of temper rarely show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That consistency raises a question the earlier sections never needed to ask. The chicken fights come with no explanation, and Stewie's anger eventually gets one, decades later, in a single, honest conversation. Peter's treatment of Meg has never gotten that same answer, though one much earlier episode did attach a number to his overall judgment and impulse control, offering the closest thing the show has ever given to a reason behind his poor decisions in general. Section 9. The low IQ explanation the show gave itself. That episode is called Petarded. It is the 6th episode of Season 4, and it first aired on June 19, 2005. According to reporting on how the episode came together, the core idea for the story came directly from series creator Seth MacFarlane, though the actual script was written by Alex Sulkin and Wellesley Wild. The episode opens with something small and ordinary. During a game night with neighbors, Lois secretly gives Peter the preschool-level cards during a round of Trivial Pursuit, letting him win without him realizing the questions were far easier than the ones everyone else answered. Rather than enjoy a harmless little ego boost, Peter takes the win as proof that he must be some kind of genius, and he starts acting insufferably proud of himself in front of everyone around him. Brian, unable to sit through much more of that behavior, challenges Peter to prove his intelligence for real, pushing him to apply for a genius grant program that requires taking a formal exam first. Peter, confident the test will confirm exactly what he already believes about himself, agrees without much hesitation. When the results come back, they say the opposite of what he expected. According to the episode, and confirmed by multiple sources describing the same test result, Peter's score places his intelligence at around 70, a number that, according to how these tests are generally understood, falls into a very low range, close to the line separating an average result from a diagnosis of intellectual disability. In the show's own telling, Peter lands just on the wrong side of that line, officially classified in a way the episode treats as a serious medical fact from that point forward. At first, this news devastates him. He is shown reacting with genuine sadness and confusion, describing the day as one of the worst of his life. That reaction does not last very long. Once Peter realizes how differently people treat someone with a diagnosed intellectual disability, disability, showing more patience, more forgiveness, and fewer consequences for behavior that would otherwise get him in serious trouble. He decides there might actually be something worth taking advantage of here. Rather than work through what the diagnosis might mean for him honestly, he starts using it as a shield, leaning on it whenever it becomes convenient, expecting the people around him to excuse almost anything he does, simply because of the number attached to his test results. That decision does not stay small or harmless for long, which fits a pattern this video has already covered several times over. Peter, testing the limits of how much he can get away with, ends up causing a serious accident that leaves Lois severely injured, suffering burns bad enough to require an extended hospital stay in a full body cast. The consequences of that accident spread beyond the injury itself. Because Peter has now been declared officially unfit due to his diagnosis, and because Lois is unable to care for the children while she recovers, the state steps in and removes Meg, Chris, and Stewie from the home entirely, placing them elsewhere while the situation gets sorted out through the courts. This turn matters because it captures, in miniature, almost the exact same shape found in nearly every other example covered throughout this video. Something relatively small happens at first, in this case, an exaggerated ego after an unearned game night win. That small thing spirals through a mix of poor judgment and total disregard for anyone else's well-being into a much larger disaster, this time involving a serious physical injury to his own wife and the state removing his children from the household. And once again, nobody in this sequence stops to ask what might actually be driving these choices until the consequences have already piled up far higher than the original mistake ever justified. The episode eventually works its way toward a court hearing where Peter is forced to defend himself and argue for the return of his children. During that defense, he lists off a series of real, well-known parents from entertainment history who were later exposed as having failed their own children in serious ways, using their public examples to argue that his own shortcomings should not be treated as disqualifying either. It is a strange, uncomfortable argument, built on comparing himself to people whose reputations were damaged by real accusations of abuse and neglect, treated inside the show as one more piece of Peter completely missing the point of the situation he is actually in. By the end of the episode, the crisis resolves the way most crises in this show tend to resolve, through a fairly sudden and convenient turn, rather than through any real growth or lasting consequence. Lois makes a full recovery from her injuries, regains custody of the children, and returns home. Peter's reaction to seeing her again focuses less on relief that his wife has healed and more on simple happiness that life is going back to the way it was before any of this happened. The specific diagnosis that caused so much disruption across the episode is never meaningfully addressed again in any lasting way. Life resets the same way it does after almost every other example of anger and poor judgment covered in this video. What makes Petarded worth including here, despite its ending following the same reset pattern as everything else, is the detail sitting right at its center. This is one of the only times across the entire history of the show where Family Guy gives its lead character an actual, specific, quantifiable reason for his poor judgment. The number 70 is stated plainly, treated as an official medical result rather than a vague joke about him being not very bright. According to general standards used to describe test results like this one, a score in that range falls well below what is considered typical, close enough to the threshold for intellectual disability that professionals evaluating him in the story consider it an official diagnosis rather than simply a low score on one particular day. That detail reframes a lot of what this video has already covered. The chicken fights, the constant escalation with Ernie, the instant switch from mild annoyance to full-blown violence. None of that behavior comes with any stated medical or psychological reason behind it anywhere else in the show. Petarded is the one place where the show puts something close to an explanation directly on screen, suggesting, even if only for the length of a single episode, that Peter's difficulty controlling himself, his short attention span, and his tendency to escalate small situations into enormous ones might connect back to something measurable about how his mind works, rather than simply being a personality quirk played for laughs with no cause behind it at all. all. It is worth being careful about how much weight to place on this single episode, since the show itself does not treat the diagnosis as something that sticks. Petarded plays the entire situation as a two-sided joke, poking fun both at Peter's inflated ego going into the test and at how easily society's attitudes shift once a label gets attached to someone, whether that label is accurate or not. The show is not trying to offer a serious, ongoing explanation for Peter's character across its full run. Once this episode ends, later seasons rarely, if ever, refer back to this specific diagnosis in any meaningful way, and Peter's behavior across the many years of episodes that follow does not consistently reflect someone living with a stated intellectual disability from one story to the next. Even with that limitation in mind, the number itself still matters for anyone trying to understand where Peter's anger and impulsiveness might come from across the rest of the show. A test result placed this low, even treated mostly as a joke, lines up closely with almost everything else covered throughout this video. A person with serious difficulty controlling impulses, understanding consequences before acting, or connecting a small annoyance to a reasonable, measured response would be expected to look a great deal like the version of Peter shown fighting a chicken over an expired coupon, or blaming an entire family brawl on a television screen instead of on any of his own choices leading up to it. The show never states this connection directly in later seasons, and it would be inaccurate to claim that Petarded serves as some hidden master explanation quietly running underneath every other episode covered in this video. What can be said accurately is that for one episode, the show put an actual number on Peter's judgment and impulse control, and that number happens to describe exactly the kind of behavior already documented across every other section so far. This detail also stands apart from the deeper answer eventually given for Stewie's anger, covered earlier in this video. Stewie's explanation, delivered decades after his character first appeared, comes from Stewie himself, spoken honestly and directly to the one person his anger was aimed at the whole time. It connects his behavior to a specific personal fear about his own identity, something rooted in emotion and self-understanding rather than in a clinical test result. Peter's explanation, by contrast, arrives early in the show's run, stated by outside professionals rather than by Peter himself, and framed as a diagnosis rather than as a personal confession. Where Stewie eventually comes to understand himself, Peter is simply told what he is by someone else holding a clipboard, and the show never brings him back around to reflect on what that result might actually mean about the years of behavior that came both before and after it. Looking at Petarded next to everything else covered throughout this video leaves a strange, unresolved picture of Peter Griffin as a character. He is given, for one single episode, an official, measurable reason for his poor judgment, stated clearly enough that professionals in the story treat it as a serious medical fact requiring real intervention from the state. That explanation then gets folded away by the end of the same episode, never picked back up in any lasting way across the many seasons of chicken fights, family brawls, and unfair treatment of Meg documented throughout the rest of this video. The show hands its audience a clear, specific reason for exactly the kind of behavior it spends most of its run treating as unexplained personality quirks, then chooses not to use that reason again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Peter is far from the only member of the Griffin household whose anger runs through the show without ever receiving a clear explanation. The people living around him, from his closest friends to his own neighbors, carry versions of the same short temper, expressed in smaller, quieter ways that rarely get their own dedicated episode the way Peter, Stewie, and even Lois eventually did across the stories already covered in this video. Section 10. The rest of Quahog is just as wired. Every example covered so far in this video lives mostly inside one house on Spooner Street. Peter's fights with a chicken, the lethal weapons brawl, Stewie's decades-long war with his mother, and the uneven way Peter treats his own daughter all happen inside or right around the Griffin family itself. Step outside that house, though, and the pattern does not stop. The friends who spend the most time around Peter carry versions of the same short fuse, sometimes expressed in ways just as sudden and just as disproportionate as anything documented inside the Griffin household. Joe Swanson lives next door to the Griffins and works as a police officer with the Quahog Police Department. According to reference material describing his character across the full run of the show, Joe is a muscular, physically capable paraplegic who lost the use of his legs during an incident connected to his police work and who refuses to let that injury slow him down in almost any part of his life. He remains an active officer, excels in physical confrontations despite his wheelchair, and is generally shown as tough, determined, and fiercely loyal to his friends. Sitting right alongside all of that toughness is something reference material covering the character describes plainly and directly. Joe is written as someone with real, ongoing anger problems, the kind that show up suddenly and violently at unpredictable moments throughout the show's run, rather than building slowly towards some clear breaking point. One specific example, given in that same reference material, involves Joe's son, Kevin. As Kevin grew older, he began to beat his father in athletic competitions, something Joe apparently could not handle well at all. According to Joe's own description of what happened next, delivered with the same casual tone the show often uses for its darkest jokes, he responded to losing to his son by hitting him, describing it starting as something he framed to himself as a small, congratulatory punch on the arm, then another, until the moment became a blur. The result of that blur was serious enough that Kevin ended up living with a foster family for a period of time afterward. That detail lines up closely with almost everything else covered throughout this video. A small, ordinary event, in this case, a father losing a friendly athletic contest to his own son, turns into something far more serious than the situation ever called for, expressed through sudden physical force rather than words. Just as importantly, the show treats Joe's own explanation of what happened with the same casual distance Peter shows after most of his own outbursts. Joe does not describe the incident with guilt or horror. He describes it almost like a funny, slightly embarrassing story, glossing over the seriousness of what actually happened to his son, with a tone that treats the whole thing as a minor family mishap rather than a real act of abuse. Another documented example of Joe's temper comes from an episode called The Fat Guy Strangler, where his anger gets triggered by something even smaller than the Kevin incident. After being mocked by his friends for failing to finish a large steak, Joe responds by shooting what remains of the meal, then turning the same gun toward the friends who were mocking him only moments earlier. The trigger here is about as minor as anything covered anywhere in this video. A joke made at a dinner table among close friends, and the response involves a real weapon pointed at the very people making that joke. Nothing about the size of the insult comes anywhere close to justifying the size of Joe's reaction, which fits the exact shape this video has traced again and again across completely different characters. A separate detail found in reference material describing Joe points towards something slightly more specific about where his anger tends to come from. According to that material, Joe's temper flares most sharply in situations where he senses his own authority slipping away from him, an idea supported directly by an incident in an episode called Road to Rupert, where Joe reacts with clear overreaction after Peter makes it unexpectedly difficult for him to revoke a driving license during a routine piece of police work. For a character whose entire identity is built around being a capable, respected officer of the law, even a small joke at his expense during an ordinary task seems to strike at something Joe cannot easily brush off, turning a minor inconvenience into a much larger reaction almost immediately. That detail sets Joe apart in a small but meaningful way from everyone else covered throughout this video. Peter's anger tends to explode over physical annoyances and social embarrassments, whether that means an expired coupon or a joke his daughter was not supposed to make. Stewie's anger, once explained, traced back to fear about his own identity. Joe's outbursts, according to the pattern described described across these examples connect most directly to moments where his authority or control over a situation feels threatened. Whether that threat comes from his own son beating him at sports or from a friend fumbling a simple bureaucratic task Joe is supposed to be handling with full confidence. The specific trigger changes from character to character throughout this video. The basic shape underneath it, a small event, followed by a reaction wildly out of proportion to what actually happened, stays exactly the same, no matter who is at the center of it. Quagmire, another close friend living on the same street, carries a smaller, lighter version of this same idea, one already touched on earlier in this video during the events of Lethal Weapons. His habit of calling emergency services after minor injuries, delivered through a single line, suggesting this is far from his first call of this kind, points towards someone with an unusually low tolerance for discomfort, quick to escalate small physical mishaps into full emergency responses. It is a softer echo of the same basic pattern found in Joe and Peter, expressed through a habit rather than through violence, but built from the same underlying idea that something small deserves a response far larger than the situation actually requires. Taken together, Joe's explosive temper and Quagmire's habit of treating minor mishaps like genuine emergencies suggest that the anger and overreaction covered throughout this entire video was never really limited to the Griffin family alone. It runs through the friend group surrounding them as well, showing up in different forms depending on the character, but following the same basic outline almost every time. A small trigger, a response far larger than the trigger deserves. And, just as with every earlier example in this video, no lasting change or growth once the moment has passed. A separate piece of material, built outside the show itself, but drawing entirely from what the show has depicted on screen, reaches a similar conclusion, using a much more formal structure. A document written as a therapy intake assessment, built by someone studying family therapy and using the Griffin family as a case study, treats the entire household the way a real therapist might treat an actual family walking into a first session. The document is not an official part of the show. It was written separately as an exercise applying real clinical thinking to a fictional family's documented behavior, but it draws its entire basis from patterns the show itself has put on screen across its run. According to that assessment, the immediate reason the fictional Griffin family would end up in a therapist's office involves Meg specifically, following a pattern of acting out that includes hitting her brother Chris with a broomstick and breaking one of his belongings. The same document does not stop there. It goes further, suggesting that the roots of this behavior reach back through the whole family, rather than belonging to Meg alone, noting that Peter and Lois both appear, based on how the show portrays them, to come from their own difficult backgrounds involving neglect. Based on that reading, the assessment recommends that anger management would benefit not just Meg, but Peter and Lois as well, describing the pattern running through the household as something passed down across generations, rather than something belonging to any one person inside it. This document was never part of the actual show, and it carries no more authority over the characters than any other piece of fan-made writing built around them. What makes it worth including here is how closely its conclusion lines up with everything documented across the rest of this video, using material the show did produce. A person working entirely from the show's own scenes, applying real clinical thinking rather than comedy, arrived at almost the exact same picture already built piece by piece across every section so far. Anger inside this world does not belong to one character. It moves through an entire family and, as covered in this final section, through the friends surrounding that family as well, following the same basic shape again and again, regardless of who happens to be carrying it in any given episode. Looking back across everything covered in this video, a single consistent picture comes into view. Peter's decades-long war with a chicken begins over an expired coupon and never once slows down long enough for him to reflect on why he keeps ending up in the exact same fight. An entire episode built specifically around anger ends with the family blaming a television set, rather than looking at any of the choices that actually caused the damage sitting around them. Every attempt to bring in real outside help whether for Stewie or for the family as a whole, collapses before it can produce anything lasting, either through sudden violence or through a much colder, more deliberate kind of avoidance. Stewie's own war against his mother reaches its most serious point in a story that erases itself completely, only to receive an honest explanation decades later that the show immediately allows both of its central characters to forget by morning. Peter's treatment of his own daughter shifts and sharpens across the seasons in a pattern serious enough for people who track the show closely to notice and describe in detail, without the show itself ever directly explaining why. The one place the show does offer something like an explanation, a specific number attached to Peter's own judgment and impulse control, gets used once and never picked up again, and the anger running through all of it never stays contained inside one house, reaching out into the friends and neighbors surrounding the Griffins, showing up in a police officer's explosive temper and a neighbor's habit of treating minor bruises like true emergencies. None of these examples exist in isolation from one another, and none of them were likely built with some master plan connecting every single one across more than 2 decades of episodes. What connects them is something closer to a recurring instinct running through how this show tends to write conflict, again and again, using dozens of different characters across hundreds of episodes. Something small happens. Someone responds with far more force than the moment calls for. The people standing nearby usually get pulled into the damage along with whoever the anger was originally aimed at. And once the moment passes, almost nothing about the person at the center of it actually changes, leaving the exact same conditions in place for the next small thing to set it all off again. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.